welcome to Talking Mental Health Season 2. So in Season 1, I sat down with mental health professionals and we talked all things mental health and wellness as it relates to college-age young adults. I'm super excited about this new season because in Season 2, we are going to create a Part 2 for every Season 1 episode. Except in these episodes, I'm going to sit down with college-age young adults themselves. We're going to watch the Season 1 video, we're going to react to it, talk about the things that resonated with us, talk about extra things, talk about how they relate to it. All the things. I'm very excited. I have one of our Studio Wesley interns here today to be a part of this episode, but before I bring him on screen, we are going to be reacting to Part 1 from Season 1 on eating disorders. So for this episode of Season 1, I sat down with Lori Osachy, who is a licensed clinical social worker, owner and director of Body Image Counseling Center in Jacksonville, Florida. It was a great episode. She gave us so much information that I was so excited to be able to do this Part 2 and get a college student's reaction to it. So I'm going to pull Samuel up and let him give you a little introduction to who he is.
Hey guys, my name is Samuel. I am a freshman at American University up in DC studying political science and communications. And I'm also one of the new interns for Studio Wesley this year. So I'm very excited to be here.
We're very excited to have our Studio Wesley interns. And so far, this is the first time Samuel's been on Talking Mental Health, but I've done a few other things with him. And the things he said have been so great that I'm so excited he's here. So if you're ready, Sam, we'll just go ahead and get into it.
After that intro, I feel like I have to be. I gotta say something smart now.
All right. So just first question, and I'm going to ask this in every episode just to kind of get a general idea of where we were before you watched this episode or you watched the Part 1 episode. So what did you already know about eating disorders?
So my relationship with the eating disorders is all very peer-based because I contacted Allison before this episode and was like, I haven't had experience with this. But as I sat back and look at the people I've helped in my life, I have a lot of friends who have struggled with eating disorders or disorders of eating of different kinds, which is one of the things they talk about in this podcast. And being the kind of person I am and the circles I find myself in, I've had to help a lot of people in whatever ways that friends in school can as a resource. I've been helpful to a lot of people. So all of this is relational and none of this is my information. All of it is based off of real people's experiences in my life and some statistics I look up beforehand. But yeah.
Yeah, and I think I'm excited for this perspective too, because a lot of things we did in Part 1 in Season 1, every topic we talked about, we related it back to peer support as well, because our peers in college are sometimes our biggest support systems. You know, we move away from home, no matter how far that is. We're not seeing our families typically, depending on whether, some people obviously do still stay at home for college, but typically you go away and your peers become that support system that you had back home. And so I'm excited for this perspective of the peer. Just because I think it's important to have those conversations as well.
And not to jump ahead and jump the ship, but that was one of the parts that resonated most with me in that episode is seeing Dr. Lori. You asked the question about what are some of the steps? What are some of the things you can do to work through and work with a mental disorder, like an eating disorder? But the first thing that she said was talking about peers. And that really, really struck a chord with me because it's one of those things you don't often think about. A lot of times when we talk about mental health, it's either the clinical, who you're going to go see, what kind of medication you're on, those kind of treatments, or it's personal. But a really big part of, I think, all mental health journeys, including some of the ones that I struggle with, is peer related and making sure you're connecting with other people and finding that support system. So I'm really glad that was the first thing that Dr. Lori said right off the bat, was finding your peers who are going to help you through it.
Yeah, and I might have to go through and figure out which episode this is from and who said it, but there's an episode from last season where the professional said something along the lines of, in a crisis, your first line of support is not going to be the emergency workers. It's not going to be, the police or the ambulance or the fireman. It's going to be probably a peer. They're probably going to be that first response before anything else happens. So I also kind of liked that little section where we were talking about peer support and the things peers can do. And we can skip ahead to that a little bit because I wrote down some notes on it as well because I love talking about peer support in these situations. And I appreciated how she clarified that, sometimes, I'm trying to remember how she framed it. Sometimes you have to be woken up when you have an eating disorder by someone who cares about you. She said that, and I was like, I don't know if beautiful is the right phrase, but it was eye-opening rather to hear something like that you have to be woken up, taken out of that place that you're in to fully realize what you're doing to yourself.
That was what I was about to point out when you said that first line of support, is
Mm-hmm.
that sometimes it feels like the layer before that it's the people who start the journey of support. Like
Mm-hmm.
I have had many interactions with people, some of the people I'm closest with in my life, who the position that the mental health journey starts on is by a friend or a loved one
Mm-hmm.
pointing out something, like you said, and like beginning to just plant that seed of like, how are you doing? How is this going? Because a lot of times it's the loved ones in your life who notice things before you do, especially in a thing like an eating disorder where it becomes so habitual
Mm-hmm.
that Dr. Lori said at one point, like when you don't even realize that you've been like almost starving yourself because of the amount you're trying to limit. And so a
Yeah.
lot of times in my experience of what I've been a part of, it's the family members and the very, very close friends who are the first people to point stuff out and make sure that you're doing okay.
Yeah, and that's some of what she said too, saying those, pointing out those physical signs to them, from a direction of, I care about you, but I've noticed these things. You're not yourself. You've lost a ton of weight. You've dropped classes. You're not socializing with us like you used to. And that's the things that those close family members or those close friends are going to be noticing before anybody else. They're going to notice those signs because they do spend so much time with them. Yeah. I'm just curious. So we've kind of talked about this a little bit, but I want to start going into kind of those things that resonated with you in this video. So just name the first thing, unless peer support was the first thing, then the second thing that resonated with you.
Peer support was my first thing, so I'm really glad that we started with that
Mm-hmm.
because I think again it's that first line of defense. The other thing that I really appreciated being discussed, especially by professionals in this field, is talking about the correlation between past trauma and eating disorders
Mm-hmm.
and the idea of lack of control. I think that was one of the things that should really be talked about with this issue, where a lot of times the birth of eating disorders can start from that. Can
Mm-hmm.
like whatever happens afterwards, it can usually start from a lack of control because of past trauma. And a lot of times for the actual physical food element, that is a way you can control something. You can
Mm-hmm.
cause a change. And although it's not healthy, that's sometimes the reasoning that starts the disorder from
Mm-hmm.
what I've seen with a lot of the people I know. Um, because it starts with sometimes you're in a position where the food you're intaking is the one thing you can control and the one area of your life where nothing else controls it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that lack of control, I think it spirals into a lot of different mental health issues, but eating disorders is one of the biggest ones that I've seen it turn into.
Yeah, and I think she used the word replacement. I think she said that it becomes like this replacement for like those underlying traumas or issues or things that you've been going through. And so I think that's, yeah, kind of along the lines of the things you were just saying.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I've seen one of the things that I've noticed recently in this journey, because I just started my freshman year of college. I'm
Mm-hmm.
a little over the first month, and it's a big thing with something as big as moving away.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of freshmen struggle with many mental health things, but eating disorders are one of the top because there's a massive amount of change, and it's the first time you're making decisions fully for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And so you are trying to find that control again. You're trying to make a situation, make an environment that you are in control of. But
Mm-hmm.
also, there's a deep societal stigma. I wrote this in one of my notes. She talked about we live in a world that perpetuates these unhealthy habits, and one of the first things I thought
Mm-hmm.
of is the freshman 15 versus the anti-freshman 15,
Mm-hmm.
because that is one of the conversations I hear the most among my peers right now
Yeah.
is I got to do this because I can't have the freshman 15. And while that can lead to good habits starting, it also is the breeding ground of really, really dangerous stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen people who have started eating less and less because you have to make sure you're not getting that because it's a new place and I'm finding out my own system. And it can really, really create some bad habits early on.
Yeah, and I think it goes into that whole conversation. She was talking about how stressors can be a big reason that someone struggles with eating disorders, and that all of that is such a big stressor. Leaving home, body image issues, constantly hearing your whole life, "Don't go to college and gain freshman 15," like all things like that. Those phrases that we say as a society so normally that we don't realize how much harm they're actually going to cause someone. Um, yeah. And I think,
I
yeah.
wanted to bring up two. I wanted to bring up two interesting points that aren't from the podcast.
Mhm.
That I was having some discussions with some of my peers and some of the people I'm closest with, who have more knowledge about this and firsthand experience with eating disorders.
Mhm.
And two of the things that we talked about is a lot of times, like the biggest statistics we see, which are entirely true, are about women and how the societal impacts can stigmatize and create these terrible habits, which is
Mhm.
all completely correct. But two of the things that I ended up talking with people about is the two silent minorities of eating disorders, which are the LGBTQ and trans community, and then also men, which I appreciate that she brought up in it. Because so for the LGBTQ community, the statistics are really, really staggering, especially for transgender college age young adults, because part of it is a lack of control. And part of it is also, like she said in the podcast, a body image thing and
Mhm.
not feeling safe and not feeling yourself in your own body. So, the statistic I found from one of the health journals in my area was talking about transgender college age young adults are 4 times more likely to report an eating disorder than their cisgender female peers.
Mhm.
And so taking that highest statistic that we already talk about of cisgender female college students and showing how much it explodes in these communities, I think is really important and not as talked about since it's a new
Mhm.
field of research. But then also coming from, again, some of my friends' experience, but this time some of my own, one of the interesting things is that our society is still very, very built on negative body images. But as we start making strives for better body positivity in media, in marketing, and things like that, there is an argument to be made about, like, especially young teenage boys being left behind in that marketing. I used to work at Old Navy. It was my first job. I was 16 years old, and that was when a lot of marketing and big, like, clothing companies started, like, going with their body positive or equality lines. At Old Navy, it was called Body Quality. But one of the things that people learned is that it was really targeted at women or feminine clothing products and was not had not rolled out to men yet. And, like, Dr. Lori talked about it in the podcast of, like, yes, this is an issue that predominantly affects women and cis women, but there are groups that are silently suffering or
Mhm.
are quieter in their suffering, and I think it's really important to name those people, especially since in marketing, in media, that's not who we see when we
Mhm.
talk about these issues. When we talk about that's not who we always see. So, wanted to bring that up. That
Yeah.
was a conversation that really resonated with me.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you bringing that up too, because I think sometimes when we have these conversations, unless we're specifically speaking about different communities, I think we do get stuck in that, this percent of women, this percent of men. And that's like as far as
Mm-hmm.
we go. And I think adding in those statistics and adding in these pieces to these conversations is super important because that's just not how society works. There is not black and white, two boxes. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think it's important to name things like talking about the LGBT community and their prevalence of eating disorders. And then also, I just feel like men's mental health, I've said this in other episodes, but men's mental health is not talked about enough. And they're
Yep.
often kind of that space of like, there's stigma in mental health in general, but there's a higher stigma in men's mental health. So I do
Mm-hmm.
appreciate you naming kind of both of those things. I think they're super important to include in this episode, just to get more information out there and tear down some of that stigma. That's the word I was
Yep.
looking for. Watch my brain processing that one. Yeah, I appreciate
Went
that.
through all the different adjectives and verbs. Mm-hmm.
That's what it did. It was like just cycling. Which words do we know? um,
Yeah, that has been some of my biggest experience. I also come from a theater and arts background, which theater and arts and the culture of negative body image go hand in hand in a weird way. And so that's been a lot of my experience is through a lot of minority communities or just communities that mental health isn't talked about as much,
mhm,
and how much it can really, really grow in those communities.
mhm. Yeah, it's that's part of the reason why I love talking about this stuff. I just think it's so helpful to have, like, even like you said, when I reached out to you for this, you were like, I don't have a lot of experience with it. And I was like, let's talk about that. Let's
Mm-hmm.
open up your experience by talking about the subject, educating on the subject, because then you had conversations with people, like you said, to kind of prepare for this. That kind of opened up more things for you, which I just think all the things. Um, yeah, I'll say
And
one thing. Yeah, go for it.
no, you go first.
No, it's kind of it's transitioning into a different thought. So if yours relates and you want to
Oh,
like,
yeah, I was going to bring up like part of why I love conversations about mental health is once you lift off the barrier of this taboo topic that
mm-hmm,
people used to not talk about as much, it's that realization of we've all gone through it before in different ways,
yes, yes,
including like, because I have helped many friends and family members and people very close to me. But then when you finally start having discussion about it, and people you've known all your life who you never knew struggled with these kind of things. And that happened to me. So, like, there were multiple people who I've known forever who I said, I'm going to be on this podcast. I'm trying to get more information. And they were like, yeah, so my experience.
mm-hmm,
And the other thing about that is a lot of them talked about that experience starting in college, starting
yeah,
either in late adolescence when you are, or early adolescence when you're in high school and everything is changing, or really those college years when you are
mm-hmm,
in sometimes a new place, a new area, always like a new state of mind. And
mm-hmm.
how it really is, I said it earlier, but like a breeding ground for unhealthy habits unless you keep them in check.
Yeah, and I think that's when looking for topics for these episodes, that was one of the reasons I went down this road as eating disorders, because one, like you said, the prevalence in colleges is so high, and Dr. Osachy even said that in the video. But two, because this is so, as far as we've come in mental health and as much as we talk about it now versus years ago, obviously we still have a really long time to go, but this is still one topic that you just don't hear that often. And like you said, though, if you bring it up and someone is comfortable with talking about it, though, they will. It's sometimes I feel like we're lacking the space, or people do not feel like they have the space to talk about these kinds of things. And so having these conversations is important, because when you start to have it, they're like, oh, this is okay, I can talk about this, because I think we never know what spaces it's appropriate in, but and I want to like throw that word appropriate away completely, because I think that builds the stigma. I think I think we just need to have these spaces, more spaces that are open to having these discussions. And I think that's so important to mental health itself, is not keeping it inside.
And part of why for this specific topic I think it's so important, and this is Sam Styles Williams' opinion. This is not, I'm not a clinical health expert, but with eating disorders and body image specifically, it feels like the most societally ingrained mental
Mm-hmm.
health struggle. Like,
Mm-hmm.
it feels like, maybe ingrained is not the right word, perpetuated, like these symptoms that are very real and have extreme consequences a lot of times can be shaped, and there's fuel to the fire by the media we consume and by the
Mm-hmm.
world we live in, the things we see. I really appreciated the doctor talking about orthorexia, I think I'm saying that
Mm-hmm.
right, and talking about
Yeah.
the culture of lose weight, burn calories, eat less, eat clean, and how dangerous that can be, especially to young people.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to the freshman 15 example, I know people who, at like, even just in my month of college, who, along with eating less, are trying to make smarter choices, but that sometimes means not letting yourself ever take the elevator. That sometimes means going as far and pushing your body as hard as you can to exercise all the calories you're gaining out. And it really just keeps spiraling.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're in the beginning of that, and it's one of those habits that sooner or later sometimes can catch up with you, because everyone around you, society, marketing, family members even sometimes, are pushing that idea of less is more, and you want to look as good and thin as possible.
Yeah, and it's so that's actually my like first. This resonated with me the most, because so I'm a social work major, and one of the classes I had to take last semester was literally just like going through the whole DSM-5, learning about every diagnosis, talking about it, how do you treat it, how do you recognize it, and so when she started talking about orthorexia and how it's not even a technically diagnosable mental illness within the DSM-5. That resonated with me specifically, because I think it's important to name that the DSM-5, I mean, it's the most recent edition. It's not a super old edition of it. And so the fact that just in that many years we've progressed to having this other mental health disorder in that short amount of time, this whole other eating disorder has popped up. And I think that's so important to name, especially because I can speak to it. I don't know how many times when I'm scrolling Instagram or TikTok or something through the day that I see videos about clean eating. I see videos about,
Yep.
don't put this into your body, put this into your body. Workout routine when you've eaten this many carbs. Like, it's just like all these unhealthy videos that go straight into that. And it makes me think of, younger girls who are scrolling, and younger, everybody who's just scrolling, and that's the things they're seeing. And so that was my first. This really resonated with me because I remembered that part specifically from the first time I recorded it, because it had such an impact. And it also,
And
because
with
she goes, yeah, go for it.
I was gonna say with the conversation of this new diagnoses, part of it
Mm-hmm.
is you also realize like, oh, this is calling out some of the behaviors that people think are quote unquote normal and don't
Yeah.
see as part of mental health. Like, I
Mm-hmm.
know as soon as I heard that, I thought about people that I know who have extremely unhealthy relationships with their body and
Mm-hmm.
do extremely unhealthy habits to try to lose weight. And you wouldn't say it's an eating disorder
Mm-hmm.
because when you think of eating disorder, you think XYZ. But with this new diagnosis, that's entirely what it is. You were going to say, sorry, I got excited.
No, you're good. You're good. I'm glad you said that too, because it kind of swings into what my next thought was on it. Is she, after kind of talking about orthorexia, still in kind of the same mind frame as she starts talking about the shift from, her childhood, from diet culture to what
Mm-hmm.
society now sees as a healthy lifestyle, but is still detrimental to people's health, mental health and otherwise. And because we're
Mm-hmm.
calling it a healthy lifestyle, it seems okay. And she goes into that. She went into that whole like morality component of it, of like, if you don't eat clean, you're morally wrong. There's something wrong with you. And people who eat clean, they're pure, they're great. And so I think it's interesting too to talk about that shift from like diet culture to like these things are healthy when they're really not healthy, and how that's what we're seeing online, that's what we're seeing around us, and how unhealthy that really is. Yeah.
One of the things that I was watching the original podcast episode and wish I could like add, which is why I'm glad that I'm a guest on this one, is morality is such a dangerous thing to put on a mental health stigma like this,
Mm-hmm.
and like to put on one side or the other. But the other one I think is beauty. I think that is the more like subversive and really dangerous. And there are strides being made to try to break that down.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I bring up the point from earlier of like who's being left behind in that. I think about when you go to department stores, and we've started seeing this shift in like body positive, as they say, like different size mannequins, things like that. But then you sometimes go to the male section and still see everybody has a six pack and everybody is a small size. And like that, it's that idea of like you have to do these things, you have to look a certain way because that is what beauty is. And I think a big thing, like you said, about scrolling through social media is such a big proponent of this.
Mm-hmm.
It's the who looks pretty right now, who's getting likes, who's getting reshares,
Mm-hmm.
and what do I have to do to be more like them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that last thing you said too, the what do I do to be more like them? And I've talked in other episodes about social media and how sometimes it can be really, really helpful, and sometimes it can be really, really not. Because, scrolling through TikTok, you can see some videos that are so helpful with mental health, the way they're formed, the way they educate, the way they make you feel not alone. And you can see other videos that almost feel like they're glamorizing it. And I think that goes
Mm-hmm.
along those lines too, is like, which side of TikTok are you going to land on? How do you know you're on the right side of TikTok? And that those things are so out of our control when you're just scrolling a For You page. Nobody really knows how that algorithm works. It's just things pop up and you're
Yep.
like, why am I stuck on every other video being this video about this girl who is this size and these are the only things she eats and this is how she exercises, and why, if I try that, is it not working?
Mm-hmm.
And so social media is such a big thing right now. Well, yes, it's a big thing, but it can have such a harmful effect on people if not used in the right way, for sure.
And I appreciated what you said about like there are people that glamorize it, and I think
Mm-hmm.
that's a lot of different mental health struggles. Is there are very like good creators and good resources on the internet. Dr. Lori actually talked about some of the websites you can use to help with this, but there's also that there are certain people who will say that it's not real, and then there are also, I think, more dangerous, like you said, are the people who will say this is correct, this is a good lifestyle. And it's dangerous, especially seeing that in a young formational time in your life when you grow up and that's what you've been seeing. It
Yeah.
does feel like that's what you're supposed to be doing. It feels like you are wrong or you're doing something incorrectly if you don't look like this person or if you don't have the same lifestyle as this person.
Mhm.
That's why my comment earlier about like the like arts and this, it I think it stems from movies and stems from pop culture, but like I've had friends growing up in theater who I am auditioning for this role or I'm in this show, so I have to look like this celebrity. And if
Mhm.
that means that I do a 6 hour rehearsal and I don't eat afterwards, then that's what that means. Because again, it goes back to what we're talking about, the things you see around you. How do you perpetuate that? How do you look like
Mhm.
that? And that's why I think using the definition of orthorexia is super important, because there are people who will say I'm fine no matter what's going on, and sometimes expanding diagnoses and putting new labels on things helps people realize like, oh, am I doing something unhealthy? Especially with orthorexia, which is the things that cause it and perpetuate it are things that are seen by society as healthy.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think too, just like if there's one thing I could pull out of this whole video, it's orthorexia. Like if that was one thing where I was like, I want this out in the world, because I had never heard the term before. I have not heard it since. That is the one
Yeah.
time, and this is the second time, third time if you count me rewatching the video, that I've ever heard this conversation around this word. And so I think it's important to name. It's important to be informed about, I guess is where I'm going with that.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious, as a college age young adult, as someone who is around people who are experiencing these things, one of the things Lori said in this video is that some college campuses do have resources. They have resources for people who have eating disorders. Um, However, I have never seen it. It's not something that I knew existed. I'm not sure which colleges have it or how you access it. So I'm curious, along those lines, what is something that you think would help you better prepare to assist yourself and others around eating disorders?
So I think the two biggest things are conversations,
Mm-hmm.
because conversations serve two uses that we've hinted at both and talked about, which is one, pulling away the stigma for people who are suffering and making sure that they feel welcome on a campus and they feel okay to say, I'm not okay, and be able to admit when they're struggling. But also, I think conversation really builds up peer strength, because I would say, like, yes, resources on college campuses are super important. We have an amazing mental health center on American University where you can get free counseling one-on-one, that's just included with everything. And that's really important. And clinical help is the best solution. But I think it often starts with peer help and peer support, and making sure that you are prepared as a peer and making sure that you know the signs of when somebody is struggling. It can be a lifesaver, legitimately. And so I think conversations are the best thing to do. Conversations and education, they help. They help. If you can know when somebody is struggling before they're able to admit it, and not push in a way that's going to make them go further down a darker path, but in a way that says, I'm here for you, I'm ready. That I think is the biggest lifesaver with all of this. Any kind of mental health struggles, but especially with eating disorders.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, and it's important. I love both of those because I think education goes into knowing the signs. You know, if we are never taught about what an eating disorder is, how are we going to recognize if someone's going through it? I think education is so important on any mental health topic. You know, if we were never taught the signs of depression, how would we know someone is depressed? If we were never taught, it's just different topics. I love the education aspect and the conversation because, like you said, if you're constantly having those authentic conversations with the people around you, the chances of them opening up to you are going to be higher. If you're just a casual acquaintance, they might not feel like they can say, I skipped breakfast this morning. and I'm not sure I'm going to eat lunch either. And these are the reasons why, I'm feeling this way and I just am not feeling like myself. And so I think I love both of those. Those were great.
And with knowing the warning signs and the beginnings of symptoms, I my advice for people who find themselves in that peer position and they think that somebody's struggling, my personal advice from what has happened in the past, including very recently on this very college campus, is starting by very subtly pointing it out. And not in a way that I'm attacking you or you are doing something wrong or I'm worried for you, because sometimes that can send people down a darker path.
Yeah.
But bringing up those issues, and the biggest thing is waiting for someone else to be ready and saying, I'm here for you. When you want to talk about this, let's talk about this. Because especially in the beginning phases of different mental health struggles, coming on too strong can be very dangerous. But noticing and being able to make someone aware is the first step to any kind of change.
Yeah, and I think she said something similar along those lines too, where she was like, you can reach out to them, you can tell them what you're seeing, but they might be resistant at first. And so then you have to figure out that line of like what's too much pushing and that will push them away. And then, but when do you ask again kind of thing? She talked about that a little bit at the very end, I think.
And I want to say something that's not a part of the podcast at all, that is just from pure experience.
Yeah.
If you are also somebody, like if you're watching this later on, and you are someone who has struggled in the past with an eating disorder, and you then find yourself in a peer position, it is very important to be able to have that perspective. It can be really helpful, but also mental health is a continuous journey. And because you've gotten through it once before does not mean that symptoms cannot relapse. And especially helping somebody out through something you've been through can be a triggering effect. And so it's always important to, no matter who you are, even if you are the peer, to make sure that you have other peers around you and people can support you, and resources, whether you're on campus, whether you're at home, whatever, making sure, because it is a continuous thing. And fighting the battle and winning it once doesn't mean that you have won forever. It's something you live with, not something you overcome. It's something I always like to say.
Yeah, I like to use the phrase helpers need help too. Whether you've been through it or you haven't, if you're helping someone through those situations, the best thing you can do for yourself is get help too. Even if it's just like, even if you walked away from that situation and you're like, that was a little uncomfortable, call someone, talk to someone. Just don't sit with it yourself too, because it could lead to, like you said, if it was something you experienced, that could be detrimental. But also, even if you haven't experienced it, it can still have an impact on you just being in those situations. Yeah.
Quoting a very close friend of mine who is part of my support network and has helped me through a lot of mental health struggles in the past. You can't fill up other people's buckets when your bucket's not full. And because a lot of times especially if you are the peer who wants to help, and that's a good thing, a lot of times you can keep trying to help people without taking care of yourself as well.
Yeah. No, I love that. That's, yeah.
I'll give her a shout out that she's in this episode.
So yeah, that's phenomenal. I might actually steal that and use it for things, because that's great. Yeah. Before we wrap up, is there any other thoughts you had? Anything else you want to share before we wrap everything up?
I think we covered a lot, and I covered a lot of big things, but the biggest thing to reiterate is that conversations help people realize they're not alone, and help people realize how common these things are, because no matter what you're going through, you aren't alone. That's the biggest, if you take anything from this episode, no matter which episode it is in any season, you're not alone. And there will always be resources available if you know where to look. And the first step of any kind of journey is realizing where you're at, and sometimes acknowledging it is okay to say you're not okay.
Yeah. So we're very thankful for you, Sam, to be a part of this episode, to get your perspective on these things. So thank you for being here.
I'm really glad I got to be here.
Yeah. If you guys haven't watched part 1, it's season 1, episode 2. I highly suggest you go back and watch it. While we did talk about a lot of things that Dr. Osachy talked about, there is still so much information to be learned from that video. There's statistics, there's resource information, and so I highly recommend that you go back and watch that. But thank you for being here. Thank you for watching, and I think that's it. I think we're good to go.